Good morning, everyone. Brian Post here, and welcome to session 4 of 16-week adoption parenting coaching and certification. I am excited and glad that you all are with me this morning and looking forward to getting into another class of good information. We're going to continue. In session 3, we kind of wrapped up by going into grief, but I didn't get to go into it as much as I wanted to. Understanding grief and stress in adoption. I think it is a very critical thing for us to look at. It is not looked at enough. We don't pay enough attention because oftentimes the experiences span back so many years. So we don't think about that so many of the challenges that our children are facing today, and even that we are facing as adoptive parents, and the hopes, the dreams, the fantasies that did not come true, that we struggled with, that we had hoped for, and now that we struggle with in the day-to-day with our child, we don't realize how deeply rooted into grief that is. And so I'm gonna kind of light this up for you and tie this into the stages of grief, because I think you're going to find this information to be slightly profound. I do myself. So what is grief? Grief is defined as deep sorrow. And the significance of that is that grief is typically a stage that we go through where we are experiencing deep sorrow, and we are allowing ourselves to experience it, and we go through it and we have it, and then every now and then it'll show back up and we'll allow ourselves that deep sorrow, and we continue on in the day-to-day. But the problem with grief, the problem with deep sorrow, is that it does not feel good. So typically we don't like to stay in that space for very long. Now we know that there are cultures upon losing a family member that they have a period of grieving. They have a period of deep sorrow, which they permit one another to grieve and to wail openly and to feel their pain and to go through it. And then there's a time to just move on. Now, we don't typically, in our Western culture, we don't typically practice that way. We have a tendency to, as soon as someone starts crying, we want to tell them it's going to be okay, or the person that we may have lost, well, they're in a better place. And if we're thinking about adoption, well, you know, our children may be crying, or our children may be missing their biological parents, and the first thing we want to say is, but we're so happy to have you in our home now, or you know, if it hadn't been for your mother's sacrifice, and you wouldn't be here with us right now, and we're sorry that your mother or your father wasn't able to do the things they needed to do, but we're grateful, so it's going to be okay. That is preventing grief from occurring. That is preventing the grieving process. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in 1969, this woman was brilliant. In 1969, let me get over here, make sure I give plenty of recognition to Dr. Ross. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. 1969, thereabouts, she identified 5 stages of grief. 5 stages of grief. There was denial, and then she identified, I'm going to go ahead and pull those up for you. So we have denial, then we have anger, we have bargaining, depression, and then we have acceptance. These are the 5 stages of grief that Dr. Ross identified as she was working with terminally ill patients and their families. And so I want to talk about these for a little bit of time. I actually got into this last week, and it was really good information, if I do say so myself. But making some connections that I don't think that we've oftentimes made to the 5 stages of grief. If you look at these 5 stages, then I want you to be looking at it from this perspective. Think about the 5 stages of grief as also the 5 stages of the adoption process, the adoptive parenting process. Now, this is a dynamic process in that it is dyadic in nature, and it is forever changing, and it is energetic. But I want you to think about at what level, if we start looking at our children's struggles, if we start looking at our struggles as adoptive parents, at what level do we become stuck? Because we know that trauma creates developmental barriers and blocks to our ongoing development and progress. If we think about the way we handle grief, deep sorrow in our society, and how we oftentimes suppress it, then that is creating a barrier through our developmental process, and it's keeping us stuck in so many ways. And then that doesn't allow us to move on through the process. We end up getting stuck. So think about this in relationship to adoption. And think about this in relationship to adopted children, and adopted parents. At what point are we becoming stuck? So we know during the stages of grief, we know that the first is denial. So if we think, the reason I'm talking about this is because I want you to pull this, I want you to pull your kind of your perception, your perspective of this back into the adoption process. So when children start to first have behavior issues, okay, so let's go back to when the adoption first begins. You know, it's all good for a period of time, and then the challenges start to surface. At what point is the denial starting to set in for the child that what they've experienced, what they have felt, what they have heard, what they have smelt is no longer a part of their reality? At what point does that occur for the adopted child? And that's at an unconscious level. I think fundamentally most of grief is unfortunately at an unconscious level. We are not consciously aware of grief, and if we were, I think that we wouldn't have quite the struggles that we do have with it. At what point does the adopted child enter denial, and at what point does the adoptive parent enter denial? So the child starts to struggle and the parent starts to struggle. At what point is denial become, a stage that we're entering into? And once we are in denial about maybe some of the challenges that are going on or some of the stress that's going on, then we move to anger. So we start to get angry because of what's being experienced. Excuse me. Now, again, I'm tying these stages in to the process of the healthy adoption relationship. So this could be, as we're looking at this from an adoptive perspective, this could be ongoing. I mean, this could span for some years. But we also have to look at this in relationship to grief, because I think grief is very important. I think as infants don't have an opportunity to grieve because we don't understand that that's what's going on. I think adopted parents oftentimes don't have an opportunity to grieve their hopes, their dreams, their fantasies, the fact that maybe if they're adopting because they could not conceive themselves, or if they're adopting because they feel like they just want to do good in the world. When you start to face some of the challenges that come along with the adopted child, I think that's when we start to drop into the stages of grief, the stages of adoption, ultimately the stages of healing. See, I think I want to look at it that way, because I think that this is where it has the potential to be the most profound. Okay, if we look at this as the stages of healing, rather than just the stages of grief, because I think the stages of grief, we think deep sorrow, we think, oh my gosh, I don't want to go there, that hurts, I don't want to deal with that. Let's look at it as the 5 stages of healing. Then it is important to the stages of our development. It's important to the stages of our growth. So you have denial, then you have anger. So you move into anger. What if it was okay for an adopted child to be angry about their life situation? And we didn't have to make it okay. In fact, the making it okay was the permitting them to be angry. And what if it was okay for adopted parents to be angry? What if you had someone that you could sit down with and you could just say, I am so pissed about this kid's behavior. And that person said to you, good for you. That is awesome. That's excellent. Tell me more about that anger you're feeling, because you are in the midst of healing right now. Oh, see, that'd be good. And then they can really work through the anger, but we don't typically do that. We get stuck in the anger. See, the 5 stages of healing are also any of the 5 areas where we can become stuck before we get to the 5th, which is acceptance. So when do we get stuck in anger? When does the child get stuck in anger? Which I believe ultimately all of these are the underlying dynamic, of course, is fear. And of course underneath that is stress, right? But when you're looking at symptoms, at what point do we get stuck? Where are we getting stuck at? And if we think about it from that perspective, if we think about that, then we start looking at what's the next stage, the bargaining. The bargaining that you think about bargaining in relationship to bribery. Think about bargaining in relationship to manipulation. Think about bargaining in relationship to parenting practices in general. Isn't that an awesome thought? Isn't that an awesome thought to think that the reason those practices are immature and elementary because they're getting stuck in a stage? Those practices are not about authentically helping the child or authentically helping the parent move through their process of healing, but it's about getting stuck. But sometimes that's what we need to go through. We need to go through that stage, right? As a parent, you need to go through and you need to do those practices until you realize that they are limited in nature so that you can move on. But then ultimately there's the bargaining that comes in trying to say, okay, if you just do this, we can do this. Or as the parents, they say, well, let's just try to do this for a little while longer, or let's just try to do this and maybe we can get this result. Maybe we can get this outcome. See, there's a fundamental problem with that, and I want you all to really grasp this. The moment you are doing anything to create something, then you're doing the wrong thing. The moment you are doing anything, any kind of practice, any kind of tool, any kind of technique to create something, some kind of outcome, then you are doing the wrong thing. And what I mean by that is that when you are doing something with the intent of creating an outcome, you are in bargaining. You're bargaining. See, that's a bargain. I'm going to just do this to try to create this. It doesn't work that way. You have to approach this process of healing through a systematic process. See, I call that, let me get over here. Let me get my pen. Oops. I call that, and we're going to talk about this we'll probably spend, gosh, half a class on this. The A to Z blueprint. Or the A to Z process. Before you can get to Z, you got to start with A. See, this is a process that we go through. And in our society, we're focused on outcomes. But what we need to be focused on is processes. So if you think about approaching any one thing, if you're doing something to try to affect Z, if you're doing X or Y to try to affect Z, you're not ever going to get what you want. You have to come all the way back to A, and you have to follow the systematic process, which then influences the outcome of Z. So it's very important to try to grasp that. You cannot take this class, nor should you take this class, this course, to learn new tools and techniques, because new tools and techniques is not what's going to get you what you want. You have to develop an understanding. You have to develop a systematic process through which you are building relationship and you are influencing relationship. You cannot just take a class to learn new tools and techniques, because the tool and the technique is not always going to be relevant to the situation. So you're using a tool and technique, and number one, you have an energy that isn't indicative of the situation. And number two, you keep using the tool, you keep using the technique, and it just creates more frustration for you because it's not working. You have to be able to develop a systematic awareness, a systematic process, which is influential to your awareness through the process of parenting, through the process of relationship building. And heck, I'd probably like to just redefine parenting as relationship building. You're building a relationship, and you just happen to be building a lifelong relationship. It's not so much parenting as it is relationship. Because relationship is what teaches, relationship is what influences, relationship is what leads to growth. So I think we really need to consider that. And I've talked about the relationship factor, and I'll be talking about that more, trying to tie that in. So I just want you to keep in mind that you cannot approach this from the process of learning new tools and techniques. You have to have a fundamental understanding. There's a huge breakdown in the field of psychology for this very reason. There's a huge breakdown in the practice of attachment parenting, attachment therapy for this very reason. You start talking about reactive attachment disorder, there's a huge breakdown from the very beginning. As soon as you label someone as having an attachment disorder, you are already operating from a perspective of misunderstanding. That is, I think that for some reason, and not for some reason, because we're afraid. We become too stressed out, we become too scared, we become too focused on the threat, and all we can think about is eliminating the threat. So we need to use the next tool, the next technique, the next pill, whatever it is that we can use to try to eliminate the threat, and we have to move away from that. We have to first understand why it is a threat to begin with. Why is it such a threat to us? Explore that passionately. Why is that a threat? And then we have to move into understanding, where is this coming from? What we are seeing, where is this coming from? What's driving our child's behavior? And then from that place of understanding, moving back into a place of creating a more secure, sustainable relationship that will allow us to influence those behaviors, therefore training and teaching those behaviors in a way that they don't have to be so threatening and so overwhelmed. So what you're essentially doing is affecting the child's very spirit. You're affecting their very brain. You're affecting the very physiology that manifests the behaviors. So we're getting to the root. So we got denial, we have anger, we have bargaining. Think about it. At what point are we becoming stuck? At what point do we become stuck and we're unable to move forward, and we just continue to struggle, in the things that we struggle with? The next is depression. So after bargaining, when do parents become depressed? I had an email from a dad the other day, said that we adopted our 13-year-old son, he's 14 now. We adopted him when he was 12 years old from Ethiopia. And, it's the first thing I'm thinking, oh my gosh, why? Bless their hearts. But why is anyone adopting a 14-year-old child from Ethiopia? That is without an extensive support network. I mean, that is the most overwhelming thing. I remember years ago I worked with parents, a set of parents who had adopted a 13-year-old from Russia, from a juvenile detention center in Russia. Oh my gosh! What is the motivation that is driving those parents? And, Ethiopia, there's a lot of warring going on. The orphanages are not good in a lot of situations. There's a lot of stress that these children face. I mean, there's all kinds of cultural stress going on in those environments. So when you bring that child at that age here, they've gone through the blueprints of their life are so established. The sensitivity of stress and their fearfulness is so significant. Oh my gosh, what is What's driving that at a conscious level? So the mother's depressed. The mother's so depressed, her adrenal glands are burnt out. The doctor said, I'm surprised she can even get off the couch. She's in depression. At some point, you just feel like there's nothing else you can do. So you become depressed. At what point does the child become depressed? And they feel like there's nothing that they can do. And then when do we become stuck at that stage? We become stuck, and it's just an ongoing dynamic. And that ongoing dynamic just drives everything. It drives the relationship. And where does the relationship go at that stage? It just continues to spiral out of control. And then when do we move into acceptance? See, now if you look at this as the 5 stages of healing, you know that acceptance as an adoptive parent is when you have finally got to the place of understanding that your child struggles and that you have to work on prevention. You have to work on acceptance. You have to work on attunement. You have to work on understanding the situations, the circumstances that send your child out of control, send your child into a state of stress and overwhelm. And then you have to continue to understand that you have to accept where you're at as a parent, your limitations, your need for support, so that you can continue to modify yourself to be able to influence your child's behavior. It's the 5 stages of healing. Where do we get stuck as parents? Where are our children stuck, and how can we support them to move through that process? I hope that was helpful. So let's talk about stress for a moment. Probably not just for a moment. We're going to talk about it for a period of time here. What is stress? What is stress? Stress is an internal reaction to either an external or internal event, moving the body out of homeostasis. The most scientific definition, and as basic as I can possibly make it, it's an internal reaction. So your amygdala senses a threat, and it has a reaction. It doesn't matter if it's internal, it doesn't matter if it's external, but it knocks the body out of balance. Now, here's what's important about this, is that you can have a stress reaction through any number of sensory pathways. And let's talk about this. When we start talking about sensory pathways, what do we think about first? We think about sight. What's important here, let me share this with you, is that when we look at something, it can cause a stress reaction. However, looking at something, the sensory pathway of sight means when we see something, it must pass through 7 different synaptic pathways in the brain before it becomes a conscious thought. 7 different synaptic pathways before it becomes a conscious thought. So you got 7 different paths through your brain. That's why you look at something and at first you don't even recognize it. Or the best example of that is when you see an old friend and at first you don't really recognize them, but then when you just give yourself some milliseconds, and then boom, their face, their memory experience all pops up into your head. 7 different pathways. And then there's smell. Smell is actually the most powerful. One pathway. Smell has one pathway from the nose straight to the amygdala. That's why you walk into something, you smell something, you immediately have a reaction. So you got sight and smell. Then you have touch. Touch is one of the most powerful sensory pathways. Touching, Ashley Montague, who wrote the book Touching, says that to just touch the skin is akin to touching the brain, because the skin is so rich with receptors. The skin is just the same as the brain. It's so rich with receptors. Touch. And then what is the other one we oftentimes think about? Sound. That's another sensory pathway. See, all of these can cause you to have a stress reaction. And then the other most basic one that we oftentimes think about is taste. These are the 5 most common sensory pathways that we talk about when we start thinking about stress. We start thinking about, OT and occupational therapy and stuff like that. However, when it comes to our children, here's what you need to be aware of, that there are some other subtle sensory pathways. And see, the thing is, any of these sensory pathways can cause your stress reaction. Any of these sensory pathways can cause your amygdala to alarm, to stir your brainstem, which stirs up all your traumatic memories. All your memories of loss, all your memories of rejection, all your memories of abandonment, all your memories of not being safe. See, any of those sensory pathways, this is why you don't always know what's driving your child. You don't always know what's sending your child and activating your child through a stage of healing, into a stage of healing. You don't know. But see, all of these are signals for the stages that your child could be in. See, you can utilize every dynamic, you can utilize every experience that you have with your child as a determinant for where they're at in their development. That's why I'm always saying, you don't look at the child's cognitive age. Don't look at their chronological age. Don't look at their intellect. Don't look at their chronological age. Look at their emotional age, because the emotional age dictates the chronological and the cognitive. But there are some other sensory pathways, 3 other ones that we oftentimes don't talk about and aren't aware of. One is temperature. Temperature change can cause your amygdala to activate an alarm to stir up your brain stem. Another one is movement. Boom, huge, just moving, a certain movement, grabbing your child a certain way. I mean, all of that can trigger a post-traumatic stress disorder episode. And then another is digestion. How much stress is there for a child around food when they have grown up in an environment of neglect? See, any of these sensory pathways can cause the brain to go into a state of stress. Any of these sensory pathways can cause the brain to move into a state of alarm. And so we need to try to be aware that when we're dealing with our children, that we don't always know what could be causing them to be stressed out or not. We experience stress through all of our sensory pathways. And now there are 2 types of stress. There's acute stress, which protects the body and is short in duration. And this is a great example of acute stress. Is you get a cold, your body begins to stress, and it starts to fight the cold. That's good, right? Well, if you continue, see, what I know is that when I got a cold just this past week, that I have to be able to rest my body. I have to be able to eat better. I have to get some good food. I have to slow down my pace. I have to stay out of the truck a little bit more and not do so much driving. And I just have to settle myself down, and I have to get plenty of rest. See, all of those things are restorative to my system. Now, I'm not fully recovered, and this weekend I've got to do some moving. So I can actually expect this cold to last a little longer, but I'm drinking my green tea, I'm taking my vitamins, I'm doing everything I got to do, and I'm going to be getting some good food instead of eating a bunch of fast food or a bunch of junk food. I make sure I get some salads, I make sure I get some veggies, I make sure I do some juicing. So all these things to help my system from a physiologic level, from a nutritional level, be able to combat and strengthen my immune system. In fact, the first thing I did this week is I went and got a vitamin IV. As soon as I knew that I started feeling symptoms that I wasn't going to be feeling good, I went and got a vitamin IV, which is equivalent to 52 oranges in my system. So, I started immediately putting the things into my body that I was going to need to combat this stress that is acquired when I become ill. So I am more stressed, and this is a lot of times why you go to the doctor and they give you a what do they call it? Prednisone shot, a steroid. Prednisone is steroid. Well, what that does is it gives you a boost in stress. It gives you a boost in cortisol to boost your body's combating system to combat the illness, which is boosting your immune system. So it's giving you a little strength, a little pickup. Now, No matter how important that is to help me fight this cold, I don't want to stay in that state of stress. I don't want my brain and my body to stay in that state of stress for too long. Because if my brain and my body start to stay in that state of stress for too long, guess what? It becomes chronic. And as soon as it becomes chronic, that starts to lead to other breakdowns, other areas of breakdown in my body. So chronic stress, it destroys the body and it doesn't go away. It just stays. It just continues on. Now, an example of chronic stress, we'll talk about some symptoms of chronic stress, but this is trauma. See, chronic stress is trauma. It's any stressful event which is prolonged, overwhelming, or unpredictable, which continues on, unexpressed, unprocessed, and misunderstood. Now, we're going to have a whole class talking about trauma, but I want to let you know, I want you to have that tie-in right now, that chronic stress is what establishes trauma, which is any stressful event. When that event is prolonged, overwhelming, or unpredictable, and it continues on, now go back to the 5 stages of grief, it continues on, the 5 stages of healing, it continues on, unexpressed, unprocessed, and misunderstood. That's the difference between short-term trauma and long-term trauma. A short-term trauma is a short-term, highly stressful event, but when you have an opportunity to express through it, you think about an infant who can cry, and then as they get a little bit older, they process, they can talk about their loss, they can talk about their feelings, and then they come to understand that this is something that all children who've been adopted go through. These feelings are common to all children. That makes the adoptive experience far less traumatic than when all of those expressions are suppressed. When we can't express, when we can't process, and we can't misunderstand, when we can't understand, that is what creates a long-term traumatic experience. And fundamentally, that is what is affecting our veterans, our wartime veterans right now. They come back from Afghanistan or from Iraq, and they are not put in environments to where they can express, where they can process, and where they can understand the events that they've gone through and make sense. They are getting stuck in the stages of healing, therefore they cannot heal. They cannot heal. They are getting stuck in the stages of grief, therefore they are not able to move on to healing. And that is what is causing so many of the violent outbreaks that we're experiencing just recently in Fort Hood, where the soldier just went on a killing spree. This is fundamentally the reason. This is prolonged trauma, and we are not dealing with it in the best way, in the most effective way. Now, what are symptoms? Now, a symptom can be, an outburst that actually leads to the death of others. But these are your common symptoms. These are your everyday symptoms. And I say common and everyday. There are soldiers killing themselves every day at an alarming rate because they cannot deal with the trauma that they've been through. So we cannot downplay that these are common symptoms and that suicide and murder is not, because that's just a common symptom of trauma as heart disease is. As high blood pressure, we just don't always hear about these experiences. But people are being murdered every minute. People are killing themselves every minute. Soldiers are killing themselves every minute. But these are the day-to-day experiences that we are looking at, that I want you to keep associated with high levels of stress, chronic stress, and ultimately trauma. Heart disease, high blood pressure, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, insomnia, weight gain, behavioral acting out. The list goes on and on. See, all of these fundamentally are rooted in stress and fear and ultimately trauma. I cannot tell you emphatically enough how our emotions affect our bodies, how our emotions affect our brains, how our emotions affect who we are. The Atlanta Center for the Study of Disease Control says that 80% of all healthcare dollars can be attributed to stress-related issues. I'm not sure why there's a question mark. Oh, it says, did you know? 80%. of all healthcare dollars. I think it's probably fundamental. It's probably bigger than that, but 80% of all healthcare dollars is huge. Cellular biologist Bruce Lipton states that 95% of all physical and non-physical illness can be attributed to stress in the autonomic nervous system. He continues on to say stress suppresses the body's immune and healing systems and causes cells to shift into self-protect mode, which over time leads to illness and disease. Now think about that from the perspective of the stress model. The stress model says when we experience stress, the cells of our bodies constrict into survival, and that survival energy is what manifests itself as fear. And that fear is what drives the emotional energy that drives our negative behaviors. Stress suppresses the body's immune and healing systems and causes cells to shift into self-protect mode, which over time leads to illness and disease. Now, tie that into this exercise. Take your hand, all right? Let's just do this so we can. I always like to look at the hand as a cell because we have trillions of these cells. So take your hand up, spread your fingers out, open your hand real wide. Now, when I say stress, I want you to ball it into a fist and hold it. Stress. Now, close your hand, ball it into a fist. Stress. Ball it up tighter. Stress. Ball it up even tighter. Now, take two hands, both hands together, and ball it up into that state of stress. Now, think about how tight. Stress. You were so stressed out. You were so dysregulated. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. You're so stressed out. Now, in that state of stress, take your hands and bang them together. Go ahead, bang them together, not too hard. I don't want you to hurt yourself. But here's the thing. The more stressed out you are, the more your cellular system is banging against one another. And if you continue banging against your cells, if your cells continue to bang against one another in that constricted, survival, stressed out, fearful way, it starts to elicit pain. And that pain starts to elicit poison into your body. And that poison, that stress, breaks down your brain and your body. And think about your child being in that state for days, weeks, months, years. That's what happens to families. Families become locked into that state of stress. And all they're doing is banging against one another. Banging, banging, banging. I said in the last session, it may have been the session before, that joy is the other path. Joy is the other path of attachment. You have to have, not only must you have stress, but you have to have joy. Because joy elicits oxytocin. So you have to be able to have oxytocin to relax the stress. That's why sometimes you just have to stop and you just have to go do something that feels good. You just have to go do something that allows you to experience some joy, some fun. Get a massage, go to the park, eat some ice cream, go to a movie, do something to interrupt the stress. Just have some fun. You have to fundamentally get out of the stress, and you have to get out of the stress consistently enough to stop the negative cycle. Now let's talk about these two important terms. These are very important, very important. Regulation and dysregulation. Regulation is the ability to experience and maintain stress within one's window of tolerance. We all have a window of tolerance for how much stress we can handle. We utilize it every day from the time we wake up until we go to bed. We utilize our window of tolerance. We're always utilizing it. As long as we're in that space of being able to pretty much deal with things, then we are regulated. It's generally referred to as being calm, focused, or relaxed. Now, the term regulation is used by literally every scientific discipline. Now, dysregulation is the experience of stress outside of one's window of tolerance. It's generally referred to as being stressed out or in a state of distress. This is a critical point. It is a critical point. Please listen to this point. This is as profound as saying stress causes confused and distorted thinking and suppresses the short-term memory. That is a critical point. Stress causes confused and distorted thinking and suppresses the short-term memory. I want you to singe that into your synaptic processes. I want you to create a neural pathway that says stress causes confused and distorted thinking and suppresses short-term memory. I want you to put that in on an index card, and I want you to look at that every single day. That is such an important point. This is another critical point, and you've got to get this. If I could reach out and shake you and say, listen to this, it's so important, I would. It is believed that affect dysregulation is a fundamental mechanism involved in all psychiatric disorders. All psychiatric disorders, not just ADD, not just ODD, not just RAD, not just PTSD. All psychiatric disorders. Guys, this is huge. It's huge. It's huge. This is so much confirmation to the stress model. Because if you could just, it is believed that being stressed out is the fundamental reason that we have any psychiatric diagnosis. This will set you free from diagnosing. This will set you free from being limited by a diagnosis. From this point forward, if you hear someone diagnose a child, you will see the ridiculous nature of it. It is believed that being dysregulated, that affect dysregulation is a fundamental mechanism involved in all psychiatric disorders. If this is true, which I absolutely believe it is, I know it is. I don't believe it is. I know it is. Then where do we need to start? Anytime we have a child who's been diagnosed. Answer me that question. Where do we need to start? Anytime we have a child that's been diagnosed, where do we need to start? Let me give you a minute to think about that. Simple. Stress. We have to start by reducing the stress. That's where we have to start. And one of the things I like to do in my lecture, because I feel like a lot of times that my audience, they just get so overwhelmed by that thought. I mean, we just get so overwhelmed. As soon as we get overwhelmed, what I say? It causes confused and distorted memory and confused and distorted thinking and suppress our short-term memory. So what do you do with that? Okay, it's very easy. Write down three things that reduce stress, and write down three things that increase stress. And once you've done that, right, 1, 2, 3. So 3 things that reduce stress: joy, exercise, family meals. Now, some of you may say, hey, family meals are pretty stressful. Well, build up to it. Have family snacks. All right? 3 things that create stress: isolation, yelling, and what's something else that creates stress? Isolation, yelling, and junk food. So I like to try to explore all the 5 pillars of health. You know, when we're talking about creating healing for children, we need to be looking at. See, this is something we oftentimes don't do. I learned this from my wife. We don't look at detox. We don't detox. When's the last time you detox your child off all the sugar? When's the last time you detox yourself off all the sugar and all the gluten? And then when we think about nervous system, that's what I deal with a lot, because that's stress. Right? And then we think about exercise. That's the physical, you know, moving your body. And then we think about nutrition. Very, very important when you start talking about, you know, all the things that are going on going into your child's body. all the things that are going, that are going into your body, the dyes, the sugars, the glutens, and the impact that that has on your system. And then at a very fundamental level, and when do we think about hormones? For parents, this is huge. Hormones, depending on your age, when was the last time you went and had your hormone levels changed? That's akin to your oil in your car. When was the last time you went and had your levels checked to find out how balanced or out of balance you may be? No one's talking about that in mental health, but you need to be doing that. You need to go get your hormones checked and find out where you're at. And find someone ultimately that really knows what they're doing. But here's what I can tell you, that if you'll do a good detox, and if you improve your nutrition and you start getting the right supplements into your body, you start exercising, you reduce your stress, you're going to start having a natural impact on your hormones. Your hormones will start to recede back into a normal state of balance for optimal health. So what's the goal here? The goal here is, once you've done these three things, then what you need to do is you need to do more of the three things that decrease stress, and you need to do less of the three things that increase it. It's very simple. It doesn't have to be rocket science. It's very simple. So let's talk about the 4 challenges to the stress model. The 4 challenges to the stress model. Number 1, the social story. This is what we hear from everyone. The social story of events and actions directed toward our person as stemming from anger. We are inundated by messages and stories about anger, someone being angry. Anger is viewed socially as a primary emotion. So he's angry, he's mad, he's violent, he's raging. Remember, we'll go back all the way to session 1, and we talk about those words that we use and how those words drive an energy. You have to think about this. Anger is viewed socially as a primary emotion, which it is not. Anger is rooted in fear, and anger is not an emotion. Anger is a feeling, and a feeling is a cognitive perception of an emotion, and emotion is energy in motion. So your brain perceives an emotion and then identifies it as a feeling. So anger is viewed socially as a primary emotion, and a reaction from anger is not only common, but oftentimes viewed as acceptable. This is why it's okay to hit our children. This is why it's okay to yell. This is why it's okay to be mean. This is why it's okay to punish. This is why it's okay to consequence. This is why it's okay to deprive, to isolate, to withdraw. This is why it's okay to do all the negative things that come along with parenting. Which, if we stop calling it parenting and we start calling it relationship building, then you start thinking about, how do we do? Isn't that an interesting thought? I have to drive my transcriber crazy with the way I just stop mid-sentence and break off into another tangent. Isn't it interesting to think how, if we stop calling it parenting and we start calling it relationship, relating, relationship building, relationship development, relationship nurturing, maybe we can come up with a new term for parenting. Kind of like the lady who's just come up with a new term for divorce, conscious uncoupling, right? It's just a different word. It's a different energy. Everyone's all up in a roar. Now you got to make it all California, shoo. But if you think about it, conscious uncoupling, there's a whole different energy there as opposed to divorce. Now, does that make it more okay? I mean, what? Does that make it less intense? Not necessarily. But when a couple are consciously going into and through a process of separating, it could make a huge difference. So what if we just redefine parenting? Think about it. I don't, it's not there for me right now, but think about it. What if all of a sudden, if we're redefining parenting, to relationship building, and anything that we did to create more stress, we know would ultimately pull us out of relationship, wouldn't we stop doing it? Would anger continue to be as common and as acceptable? I don't think it would be. So when you think about that, number 2, there are 4 challenges to the stress model. We are reinforced. Remember, the stress model says all behavior arises from a state of stress. In between the behavior of stress is the presence of a primary emotion. All behavior arises from a state of stress. In between the behavior and the stress is the presence of a primary emotion. And there are only 2 primary emotions, love and fear. It is through the expression, the processing, and the understanding of the fear that we can calm the stress and diminish the behavior. Number 2 challenge to the stress model says we are reinforced from birth that soothing lies external to our being, that things outside of us make us feel better. In this manner, we routinely seek soothing and comfort for internal states of cognitive, emotional, physical, and spiritual discomfort through external means. We routinely seek to create soothing for ourselves outside of ourselves. And that is not the key. That is not the answer. Number 3, the common social portrayal and reinforcement of victimhood is part of our daily experience. We're always allowing ourselves to feel victimized by other people's behaviors, their actions, their words. Social stories reinforce the role of victim. So just like with the soldier who went on the killing spree in Fort Hood, everyone's a victim. Everyone's a victim. When is someone taking responsibility? When is someone stepping up and taking responsibility? The opposite to responsibility is reactivity. The opposite to taking responsibility is feeling victimized. Social stories reinforce the role of victim, thereby creating disempowerment, a sense of entitlement, and a mentality of blame. Think about how that plays out in parenting. That plays out in parenting every single day. We have these social stories, and then we have groups of parents, adopted parents, that get together, and they all feel disempowered. They all feel the sense of entitlement. They all feel there's a mentality of blame. They all feel victimized, and then what do? They just feed one another. They feed one another, and it gets more negative and more negative and more negative. 10 years ago, there was a huge group of parents of children diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder who were just, it was so negative. It was so negative. And the sad thing is they have therapeutic models which are a part of this social reinforcement. We have to see this. We have to step outside of this. We have the ability to step outside of this and take responsibility. That is the key, responsibility. And 4, fear-based blame is a common social mindset circumventing the more internally directed process of responsibility. We have to be willing to take responsibility. Spend some time thinking about these 4 challenges to the stress model. Spend some time thinking about the 5 stages of grief, the 5 stages of healing, and how that plays out, and where you get stuck, and where your child may get stuck in, or where the family you're working with may be stuck, and how you can help them to honor where they're at, to move on to the next stage. And then we can pull all that together into a systematic understanding. We are moving beyond tools and techniques here, guys. We're moving beyond tools and techniques. Tools and techniques are too limited for us. They're too limited for our understanding. They're too limited for what we want to be able to do, the amount of the amount of healing we want to be able to create. We're moving beyond that. We're moving into an understanding that is applied to life and relationship, period. In this manner, our actions are a reflection of our teachings. In this manner, our actions are a reflection of our teachings. Hence, we either continue to act based on our past teaching or engage in a new pattern of self-teaching. That's the part of taking responsibility, to transform old patterns, therefore leading to new teachers. That's a big statement. That's so powerful. But if we want to raise our children to truly be responsible, then we have to break the old pattern of trying to teach them responsibility by being reactive parents. We have to look at ourselves. We have to begin a process of mindfulness. We have to begin a process of understanding. We have to begin a process of paying attention. We have to begin a process of going deep into our own emotional pain and experiences. Henceforth, beginning a revolutionary, radical process of self-teaching. This self-teaching is what will transform our old patterns. Therefore, we will become new teachers, and we will teach our children that become future teachers. You follow me? You get me? Yes. Yes. Amen. Hallelujah. Praise the Lord. Yes, it's that good. It's that powerful. And it is not simple. It is not easy. It's simple, but it is not easy. God bless each and every one of you. Review the session. Listen to it again. Think about it. Ask me questions. You've been sending me some wonderful questions after some of the sessions. I appreciate it. We'll be talking about some of those as we get deeper into the class, just to kind of reinforce and summarize. But I appreciate you spending this time with me. I think it is the highest and most valuable use of your time, other than loving your spouse and loving your child and loving yourself. Again, God bless, and I'll talk to you at the next class.